Hello and welcome to the Digital Health Growth Show. Thank you for joining us. This is presented by Fire&Spark. This is the marketing nerd's guide to growing digital health brands, where we welcome growth leaders from innovative brands to come on and wonk out together on the mechanisms and playbooks that transform their brands into market leaders. Today, we're doing something a little fun because we're taking a little detour, not strictly marketing, but today we're talking about the intersection of growth and operations, where the rubber really meets the road on matching supply and demand. So this is all made possible by my fantastic team here at Fire&Spark. We are the premier SEO agency focused on patient acquisition for digital health brands. And beyond that, this is part of the Digital Health Growth Mastermind, which is a community exclusively for digital health growth leaders, including live shows, some awesome research and data analysis we're doing, and in-person meetups, including one we just did in New York earlier this week, featuring a bunch of great brands, including Birches, Paloma, Boulder Care, Bicycle Health, Hinge Health, and of course, our friends at Allara Health. Our goal with the mastermind is that every single person involved, 1 year from today, I'll be able to chat with them and they'll tell me something they learned, a person they met that changed their career, helped them grow their brand, solve the big challenge that's been bugging them. We would love your participation in growing this community and sharing all of the great information in your brains about growing these brands. If you are interested in joining, please scan the QR code that's going to go up on the screen right now, or follow the link that we're going to put in the comments. Some real quick intros now, and then we're going to get into the meat of it. I am Noah Goldfarb. I help run Fire&Spark, where I lead organic growth strategy for the innovative brands that are transforming healthcare, including Bicycle Health, Allara Health, and Hinge Health. And Chris, how about yourself?
Hey there, I am Chris Turritson. I am the co-host of the Digital Health Growth Show with Noah. I am the founder of Single Aim, and I have worked in building virtual care providers over the last decade. Mainly my time has been spent on Virta Health and Bicycle Health, and now I work with probably a dozen other companies in building out their own growth.
Awesome. And to bring in our guests, with over 15 years of experience in clinical operations leadership, Jordana has worked in diverse clinical settings, from community health centers and government agencies to early and mid-stage digital health startups. As a clinician by background, Jordana's focus is on leading and scaling large clinical teams, empowering clinicians to do the work they love with minimal roadblocks, solving complex challenges, and expanding access to essential services to those who need it. And Josh is a growth leader who has helped scale telehealth companies serving complex, high-need patients. He previously led growth at Bicycle Health, supporting rapid national expansion for a platform treating opioid use disorder. He is now the VP of growth at Allara, where he focuses on patient acquisition and growth for a women's health platform treating hormonal conditions like PCOS. Hello, Josh and Jordana. So great to have you there. Anything else from your impressive backgrounds that I missed out on? I mostly cover it. We're good? Okay. Thanks so much for being here. And for everybody that is here, we have a awesome group of people that signed up for this and are in attendance today. So please comment where you're from, both where you are in the world right now, because I'm sure you're all over the place, and then also some of the awesome brands that are here today. Something Chris was pointing out before we got started is this is a very in-the-know topic. He's going to tee it up in a second, but the group that's here really reflects that. These are people that are growing some really impressive brands and doing some difficult stuff, and this is a difficult problem for those brands to solve. So with that being said, Chris, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, I guess first let's just ask folks if you're just share where you're coming from, what company you're working on, just so we have an idea of who's in the room here. That would be helpful for us. So as Noah said, we're talking about capacity management. I think specifically in the lens of capacity management as a growth lever. This is the Digital Health Growth Show, so we've tried to stay on topic. So capacity management basically is making sure you have the clinical staffing at any given time to match the demand that you're pushing into your service. This was something that I experienced very closely firsthand, building out Bicycle Health, building out Virta Health. If you don't have enough capacity, or if you have too much capacity, these can both be very expensive problems. If you don't have enough, you're not growing to your, the way you want to grow. or you're like overspending on marketing. And if you have too much, it can be very expensive because you have people sitting around not doing anything. As Noah said, this is kind of a problem that you know it when you know it. And I think that's why if you look at the people who showed up, are showing up here today to this live stream, it's like a more advanced group of people, in the sense that you don't have capacity problems essentially until you have demand success. So these probably you're here because you've seen overflowing demand, or at least you're expecting that to happen. So this is in some ways is a good problem to have, but also when it happens, it's a very real problem. It can feel essentially like the major limiting factor on your growth as a virtual care organization. So I'm very excited to talk to Josh and Jordana today, two people that I think balance this problem very well. The two sides of it, the ops side and the growth side. How do you constantly have that pull and push between pushing more demand versus managing the capacity? So we're going to talk all about the details there, kind of the how of how you do that. They've done this. They've scaled Allara to, I think, many patients and many clinicians. So yeah, I think that's it. Noah, back to you. Start jumping into some areas to talk about.
Perfect. Okay, let's hear from Josh and Jordana. So first up, I think we're going to end up talking a lot about your backgrounds and other places that you've worked and what this problem has looked like there. But at Allara, I'm particularly curious, like that moment Chris just described, where you're growing, you have the demand, and you start realizing that this is becoming a problem. Can you tell me? Maybe I'll start with you, Josh. Like, I'll start with Jordana. Jordana, what did that look like from the ops side? Like, what were the signals you were starting to see? And when did you start to realize that it was becoming a problem you had to really focus on?
Yeah, there's like that, I think we talk about like that panic moment when all of a sudden you're like, whoa, the numbers are really taking off on the ops side. Last week, everything was fine. This week, some of those like early warning signs, like wait times are going up, people are booking too far out. So we've certainly had those moments. There was a point earlier in 2025 when we were really gaining traction in one of our core models and doing so really fast and needing to like really pivot quickly to make sure that we were gonna like meet that demand from an operation side. And then certainly like other moments, there's a lot of like moments where you're like, oh, that assumption was missing, right? Mm-hmm. The months where churn was a lot higher than was expected, or you had more delays with credentialing or payers due to like seasonal patterns around that. So there's you're always like sort of panicking and then learning to like build that back in, which we'll talk more about.
So did that really start showing up? You said early 2025. Was it kind of all at once in early 2025, or something that you kind of realized gradually as Allara grew, as Josh did his job?
Yeah, well, right. It's a good partnership, but the right, like as you start to expand, we started to expand nationally into more states, and especially like getting in network with more payers across the country, like really opened up a lot more channels. And I think at the time we were still doing a lot of learning about it, right, like what that demand would look like, and like thankfully that was a very good problem to have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome, thank you. And Josh, from the growth perspective, when did this become something? Because I would imagine early on you're just trying, like your job is growth, mm-hmm. like you're just trying to grow as fast as possible, and then there become these signals that show up where you realize you need to start maybe thinking a bit more strategically about all of that. So yeah, what did that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's these experiments you start running that stop working. Like you run an A/B test and it's supposed to improve conversion rate, but it doesn't anymore. And you start to you have all these metrics at Allara and at Bicycle, we have lots of data, and that's fantastic. And then we have a lot of metrics that we're both looking at a lot and looking at how to improve. And I think earlier on, it's pretty straightforward, maybe the wrong term, but you kind of know what you have to do, and then you start doing it and it starts working and you're like, this is fantastic. When that doesn't feel the same, I think that's when you start to like, because it's sort of a silent killer, this capacity thing. You don't really, again, I have 10 years of experience before health was in. e-commerce and some other places, and my instincts are to go to these other if the CAC is starting to go up, or if we don't bring in as many patients in a given week as I thought we were going to, my mind has a list that it starts to race through, and I think that's kind of the trigger point is when you start hitting. You run through that list and you realize like it's actually something else. Like that's what I recall feeling was like.
Yeah.
Again, we ran like an A/B test and we were like, okay, this is amazing. We're going to implement this at 100%. It's going to increase conversion rates 25%. That all logically adds up and makes sense. And then it doesn't, and you're just left frustrated and wondering what's going on. And then you kind of look back and you're like, oh, it's very clear what was going on. Yesterday's success isn't the same as today's or tomorrow's success because you're bumping up against these asymptotes that you didn't really realize were there.
That's really interesting. So I heard both CAC and conversion rates as like two of the leading indicator metrics that kind of were, maybe yellow lights flashing at you. Interesting. And then one thing that I was particularly interested in as we were preparing for this was you were talking about the different experience of running growth at Bicycle versus Allara, just kind of like on the nature of the two businesses and how that shows up for this problem. So I was really hoping you could dive into that.
Yeah, it's the patient population is obviously very different and their experience is different. Bicycle is a very urgent and acute need, and it's also the treatment is sought after. So there's a difference, one, in the decision cycle that gets made. So people from the moment they find out about Bicycle Health to the point that they might become a patient, that decision cycle is much more compressed than Allara, because again, the urgency and the acuteness is different. Then the other thing I'd say is that I've sort of described this as there's push and pull kinds of demand generators or demand levers. Paid search is kind of your stereotypical pull. Like there's people searching, and your job is to go pull from that into your ecosystem. If people aren't searching for what you do, you don't really have the ability to pull as much. You have to go push, and you have to push out your message and get people aware of what you do. And so those are really the two big differences I saw between Allara and Bicycle was, the consideration cycle is much longer. Bicycle is kind of like Uber, right? It's like a two-sided marketplace. There's drivers and passengers, and there's an urgency to connect them at the right time. There's still, wait times and keeping those low. That still factors in. But there's just the full funnel of building awareness and then working through the middle funnel and the bottom funnel. That's been a lot more prescient at Allara than it was at Bicycle. I'd say Bicycle was much more about getting the onboarding to be extremely optimized, getting things to be very quick, speed. Time is just really the main factor that you're working through optimizing. And Allara still has a lot of the same elements, but it's also just kind of the amount of people that are signing up today, even though we know that they first heard about us, sometimes 2 or 3 years ago. Like we can see that in the data. They gave us their email in 2023 and they just now became a patient. So, being able to forecast your patient volume, your patient demand, taking into account, how many people became leads this month and last month and 12 months ago, utilizing all of that changes the math on your models.
Mm-hmm. And so, I'm trying to think about for the people in the audience today, if they're trying to figure out how to do essentially what you're describing, which is dialing in overall marketing strategy, growth strategy, trying to dial in certain channels so that there's the kind of always on nurturing kind of brand visibility, kind of seems like what you were describing there, that is more powerful at Allara. And then there's also stuff like, let's say paid advertising, which is a little bit more like you can dial it up day to day, depending on demand. So I'm trying to figure out how someone would start assessing that and kind of make those decisions about how they want to build their marketing stack, their brand. So the way I'm going to phrase this is, God forbid, tomorrow you're not at Allara, you're starting at a new brand. Like, what are the things you're looking for within that brand, within, the way they treat their patients, who their patients are, that would help you start to figure out the clues, or maybe there's data that would start to figure out the clues that would allow you to make those decisions.
Yeah. I mean, I think all all marketing really, whether you put the word growth or performance or brand in front of it, like it starts with empathy and it starts with understanding people and where they're at. And so I think anybody in any of the companies that are listening to it, I'm sure you know your patient population very well. And I think you just have to like think about what it would be like to be in their shoes. And I think sometimes that data can come from places like review platforms, for example. Like we get reviews at Allara, or like talking to patients, doing patient interviews, you surface insights, right? And I think hearing from the Allara patient population that like, I didn't know this sort of thing existed, and I'm so happy it does now, but like my entire life I felt like ignored, or I felt like I was being not listened to, or like there was just all this disconnection. I didn't know this existed, and now I'm so happy that I do know about it. That is what would tell me, that right there tells me this is going to be a push motion more than a pull motion, because I'm pretty sure there's not a lot of people, if that's what patients are saying, it's not that they went out and did a Google search for like, does something exist that could help me with what I'm experiencing? Whereas, again, bicycle is very different, and you can see in Google search trends, people are out there looking for that service, and so that there's a demand you can pull from there. So it's just kind of, I think anywhere you're going to be is probably going to be early days. You're going to need like a dialable channel. You need channels that you can turn up and down, especially based on like given like geo targeting and that kind of thing. So it's probably going to be paid search or paid social. And I think just figuring out which one of those is going to be where you'll start. It'll probably end up, as I've seen before, it'll end up being an 80-20 type of thing in the end. You'll be using both of them, I'm sure. But where you put all your focus. Another piece is going to be, I think, competition too at this stage as well. It depends on like what you are. If you're getting into something really novel that doesn't have a lot of competition, that's probably another indicator that paid search probably isn't going to be the best thing for you. Because if it is a pretty crowded space, maybe it's you have a new angle on something that a lot of people are already doing. Paid search is also going to be difficult there because there's going to be really high CPAs, there's going to be really high cost per click. So maybe there is that search demand there, but it's going to be harder to win out right from the beginning. And that goes back to like, now you're going to need to figure out how to push your message out instead of just pull from demand that exists already. So yeah.
Fantastic. Great. I'm going to pass it back over to Jordana, and then I think Chris has a few questions as well. Before I do that, I wanted to note welcoming questions from those in attendance as well. If you're hearing anything that's sparking any other questions for you, or you want to ask something that's really relevant to the challenge you're dealing with, please do so in the comments so we can address them. So Jordana, so Josh has, he's come into Allara, he's done all those things he's just said, he's built this growth engine. And now you realize that there's a need to streamline the way you're balancing growth and your capacity. Before we get into that, I know Chris has a bunch of questions about the actual model and the way you do your forecasting. Could you just like briefly explain like what's like the business value of streamlining this? Like how does this show up in terms of the metrics that the executive suite would care about?
Yeah, I think so from a business standpoint, so on the ClinUp side, one thing that I think is true, like in every company I've ever worked with in mental health and women's health, in all types of settings, is that like, I think especially that time to first visit, that time to activation really matters a lot. So, right, some of the leading indicators of that are wait time, but getting people in fast, like directly impacts everything from, right, like your CAC payback period, like long-term retention and long-term value of patients. These really matter a lot for the business, obviously. But also from a clinical standpoint, these things are actually also related to like the clinical success of your model and the clinical outcomes that you're driving. So I think there's really good like business and clinical alignment around this idea of managing this well. And so particularly so that you can get people into care, people who want care and are here ready for care need to get into care and engaged quickly. And, the best way to do that is to make sure that your model ensures that like whether it's spiking, it's dipping, it's steady, that you're there and you're ready to serve them whenever they need it, and to do it pretty quickly, like within a day or so. I'd also say that there are sort of like downstream impacts too, for like when this is going well. There's a lot of efficiencies that can be also grabbed in your talent funnel, right? It's sort of like if you're starting and stopping, we're hiring, we're not hiring, instead of doing it more steady. It's kind of like hard to like nurture the providers the way that you need to have the talent when you need it, if that's not going consistent. Same thing for like credentialing and everything downstream of that.
Yeah, I think one thing that people often underestimate is like the value of virtual services is speed, like speed and ease. Like, I mean, if you look at almost all the on-demand economy, everything you could do before, but you could do it faster and easier with the new like digitally enabled service. And I think that's what we're talking about today. Basically, it's like if you can't fulfill that promise of speed, you're essentially not fulfilling the promise of like a virtual care provider. So if you have this great service, but the appointment is 30 days out, it's kind of like a who cares situation. So anyways, let's get into the weeds because that's what we like doing. So in learning from you two, there was 4 like major areas that came out in terms of like the how you manage capacity and demand. Okay, I'm just gonna say those 4, and then we're gonna jump into the first one. So the first is a model. So you basically build out a model to describe your business, the inputs, the outputs. The second is this weekly capacity dance, which usually every organization I've talked to has some form of this. It's like there's levers you can pull, there's meetings that you have, there's people that are involved. And so sort of how does that work? The third is a constant process of speeding up onboarding. Essentially, if you could onboard clinicians instantly, this wouldn't be a problem anymore, because you just say we need more people and you get more people 10 minutes later. But because it's usually like weeks or months out, there's always a desire to make that faster. And then the fourth is this question of what's the right staffing model, and like what is the actual split between staffing models. What I'm referencing there is W-2 versus 1099, or full-time versus part-time. This answer is actually pretty hard for people to answer, and I've seen companies kind of pivot over time on this. So we're gonna talk about 4 of these. Let's first talk about the model. So you need to understand your business, basically in a mathematical way. Otherwise, you're just kind of guessing, you're poking around. And I think most companies start kind of guessing and poking around, but at some point when they experience the capacity crunch, that's when they realize, okay, I need some mathematical model here. So I'd like the audience to have a pretty good understanding of like what that model looks like, how it's evolved, and now at tens of thousands of patients, like what it looks like. So Jordana, let's just get like really specific here. What tool do you use for building and housing the model that you have?
Yep. We actually use Sheets. So yeah, this has evolved a lot. When I was hired at Allara, my practical exercise was building a capacity model in Sheets. And I think that has like changed a lot over the last couple of years, but we still house it in literally an Excel model, but there's inputs that are, some automated, some still a little manual, coming from feeding that from a few other places, including hiring data from, like incoming provider hired data coming from our applicant tracking system via like reporting and a connection to our, we built a database in Airtable where we track, that's like our provider source of truth for who's working for us. Are they active? Are they on leave? Are they offboarding? Like what is their start date if they're in an onboarding status? And so we kind of like take that, connect it to our like Excel-based tool, so that as well as analytics about current provider capacity and utilization from our practice management system. All of those things kind of connect together in this sheet that, at least on the capacity side, tell us like what we have in terms of provider hours by specialty and by state and by insurance, or whatever granular level of detail we sort of want to look at, zooming in or zooming out. And then on the other side of that is the demand information, which is like we could talk about how like Josh and I and leadership work together to set, we have goals of what we'd like to achieve. And then we build in some buffer around those goals based on assumptions and past sort of like historical data on utilization.
Okay, so you have some Google Sheets or Sheet, and then it sounds like there's dynamic inputs. Is that right? You have like some form of API situation connecting the data dynamically. Is that right?
With some of those tools, not all of them.
Okay.
Not yet, but yes, like to some extent that is automated with like Airtable data, right? We're still working. We have still some manual inputs with some of our hiring data. It does need to be sort of taken out of our applicant tracking system and loaded into Airtable manually first. So that's a problem I'd love to solve in the future.
Yeah, so you have like applicant data, you have like capacity, like real-time capacity data coming from the use of practice management system.
Yeah.
Those are essentially the ops inputs.
Yeah, with also some, I'd say like hard-coded assumptions that we put in regarding things like our expected churn rate, right, for both onboarding providers and active providers. We put in, right, some assumptions about PTO or the percentage of contracted or right employee hours that will actually be available in a given week. So we do like hard code some assumptions into that sheet as well. And then we revisit those frequently to make sure they're still the right assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And then Josh, on the growth side, what kind of inputs do you have into this model?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my side of the equation I can simplify it down. And it's historical demand and patient volume, and then the upcoming provider capacity. And this is again we're like constantly kind of going back and forth on. Usually, and going back to delivering on this promise of what telehealth is supposed to be, right? The provider capacity really just needs to be 3 to 5 days out for the really nitty gritty like spend adjustments. And then, the further discussions really inform things that are those higher level metrics, right? So when we're talking about how we have to do top of funnel and awareness building to get people down the funnel, those sorts of decisions are more informed by like the longer term view of these. So those are a bit fuzzier, but we can say for sure things like, okay, we're going to be growing, like the focus is going to be California, not Illinois or something like that, for example. So the further out in time it gets, these decisions we're going to be making, the data is fuzzier, but you don't quite need it to be so granular. But then really we take the view or the lens of like, okay, here's how many, here's the demand, here's the historical CAC of late in these states or in these places, and then what's the sort of provider capacity that aligns with that. What can be really difficult is and it's not necessarily that the data is hard to get, but it's the licensing and credentialing, the fact that so many doctors have so many different states that they're in. How do you say in your model, should I say if they're licensed in California and Florida, where would I want those dollars then to go to try to acquire a patient? Because you can't just say that there's 2 slots, there's 1 slot. So very simplistically, you could just say like, I'm going to spend half the money in California and half in Florida, but it gets really tricky to kind of align that because of all of the other myriad, complexity that goes into trying to do all these things. And I think, Chris, we've talked before about just like, you can get too cute. I think there's always a danger of like over engineering or over optimizing this stuff and thinking that like, if I just spend all night on a Google Sheet tirade, I'm going to come out the other end with this like perfect model, and CAC's going to be below where it's supposed to be, and we're just going to grow infinitely, perfectly forever. So I feel like I'm going off on a diatribe here, but anyway, I'd say the demand and the provider capacity are really like, they sound very simplistic in terms of like what they are as inputs, but they just become really a lot more complex once you have them in place and you start to figure out what exactly to do with them.
Yeah, I think you said a few like really key things there that people may not fully understand. So there's like kind of two like time frames of output. There's like the long-term output, which is essentially an input, which is like, where do we want to be? So where do we want to be in 6 months? Like, how many patients do we want to have? How many patients do we want to have in California? That kind of stuff. And then there's, which is basically growth goals. Then there's the very short term, like, and that's more of a output because it's essentially an output of the capacity. So this week or 2 weeks from now, how much space do I actually have? And it sounds like what you're saying is you actually toggle demand based on that. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So like there's a spreadsheet in your, you can imagine, well, if you're like me, you can imagine a spreadsheet in your head, but you know, the columns are, you know, how many, the rows are the states and the columns are how many days out, you know, you're talking about. And so 1 day out may have 20 slots in Florida with Blue Cross Blue Shields credentials. So then you can kind of work backwards and say, okay, we typically see X conversion rate on that. And again, it becomes this to me, very, very interesting like puzzle to try to work backwards from and say, okay, this is the exact right amount of money to spend on paid search and paid social, you know, given these inputs. And of course, then you're left with like all of the uncertainty of like, do you have the right creative messaging? Like, is your landing page optimized correctly? You know, is there something in the news that day that's changing people's, you know, so there's all kinds of like conflating factors that are really hard to always take into account. And that's why, you know, when you're talking about like setting daily budgets that are at like the state level, again, it can feel comforting to feel like I've got this model that's telling me I'm making this incredibly sophisticated, optimal decision on how much budgeting, where my budget should be going. But at times you kind of have to, I think, pull back from that a little bit and be a little less over engineering on that side.
Yeah, that
Awesome.
makes sense.
And so you have your model, you feel like you have the right inputs, and then you had mentioned, Jordana, there's this like weekly process cadence of managing against that. So who is on that team? I'm guessing Josh and yourself. Anybody else from the company that's crucial to have in the room there?
Yeah, we include our like commercial team overall in our partnerships. We feed in, we're feeding in information to, Josh hinted at this, around, you know, things like where do we want our ideal state mix to be, right? Like how are we looking ahead 3 months? There's like the idea of like a weekly stand-up where we're kind of like, where are we this week? How many slots? Like, what are we optimizing for right now? But we're also working with like our larger leadership team to like do the longer range planning together as well. To some extent, right, talent is also a part of this process. We sort of have a few different stand-ups on a weekly cadence. One of them is, right, like me and Josh sort of like optimizing our process together. And then the others are like, there's other stand-ups within my team where we're really like more focused on tactically, what does this look like this week, right? Like, do we need to make any adjustments right now to like what's like the capacity that we have available? Do we need to like make any changes on a state level, payer level? And then also, like, how are we tracking against the hiring targets, which are the outputs of this model as well? Are we sort of where we want to be with that? If not, what do we need to change there? How long is onboarding currently taking? So there's a lot of processes within operations, and then there's sort of the growth ops partnership, and both like have their own weekly sort of cadence.
Mm-hmm. And what I would love, because I'm not from the in-house side, I'm from the agency side. So I would love like to be able to picture this a bit better. Can you give me like a concrete, like a specific example from the ops side? We'll start with you, Jordana, of like, you're in one of these, you know, weekly stand-ups, you realize that there's a problem and you need to address it. What kind of levers do you have to pull on the ops side? And is there an example of that you could mention?
Yeah. The probably the most common example is, you know, if we're behind in a specific state or a market, or credentialing is taking really long with a specific payer, we've actually built within our product the ability to sort of like toggle providers on and off, like at a really granular level to new patients. So if we unexpectedly lose, 5 of our 7 providers in Illinois, I'll use a state that Josh called out before, that we want those 2 remaining providers in the short term to only be available to Illinois patients, even if they have these like 10 other licenses. So we're able to do that and like make sure that we're optimizing the capacity that we have in the way that we want, in the most balanced way possible, and in alignment with sort of Josh's goals in a given week.
Perfect. Okay, Josh, now your turn. What's an example from the growth side? Of specific ways. So when you realize you have a challenge on a weekly basis, you realize that there's a mismatch. Is there anything on the growth side, a lever you're able to pull, probably related to paid spend? But
yeah, for sure. Sorry, I had to move because the sun changed its direction. We're like pulling data in actually at the like we tweak stuff on hourly levels, at this point actually. So the adjustments are pretty real time. Like that's the benefit of having really solid data. You get something like Supermetrics or Fivetran and just pull the spend data in, but you can get it hourly, up to the minute spend data, up to the second, patient volume. And so we can constantly kind of get a sense of like, how are we pacing today versus this same day last week? So if there are adjustments to make based on those metrics, it tends to be because of something that we're seeing. Again, this is where it comes down to like the data. If you're talking about a very tactical change, meaning an adaptation to like the current capacity that you're seeing, we're typically making those on the fly, like every hour. The place that it can get really tricky is it's very simple to, or my instinct is to want to like look in the ad platform and see, and it's also the instinct, by the way, of the ad platforms themselves, to go in and see like, things are going great in Texas. We should be spending more in Texas because our cost per new patient in Texas has been phenomenal. Yesterday, we were doing fantastic. What it's not taking into account, and if you don't take it into account, it's not taking into account that phenomenal result is because of what the capacity looked like. But the byproducts of that phenomenal result is you have less near-term capacity. And so even though like the platform is saying it's the AI or whatever, it's optimized to want to spend more money in that spot because it's saying we're doing great acquiring patients there. The thing it doesn't know is that like that the element of like the booking page with all that availability that helped keep those conversion rates high, that's gone for the moment. So you have to be making that change. I think that's really one of those pieces where like before capacity becomes an issue, it just, you don't really have to think too much about it. But when you start to butt up against that, especially if you can see like this state was doing fantastic yesterday, now it's not today, that's probably when it's a good time to really like dig in closer under capacity.
Mm-hmm. You're making a great case for AI not taking your job. We need.
I was trying to be subtle, but yeah.
You build an AI to work with the AI.
I could. Yeah.
One more question on this subject, which is like the management and the kind of timeframes and the view that you have there. So we've talked about even more granular than I thought, because we had previously talked about the weekly processes, some of the daily processes. I didn't realize it got down to hourly. That's impressive and sounds very stressful, but good on you. And I'm kind of curious. And that's all kind of like the proactive, the planning, and the adjustments in real time. I'm also curious about like the retrospective and the learning from all this. So at what point are you looking back on your assumptions and your forecast and comparing it to actuals and revising your forecast from there? Is that an ongoing process, something you do annually, somewhere in between? Jordana, maybe you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, the assumptions in our forecast, I'd say, I think we're going to come across as like fanatical about this, which maybe we are, but like we're assessing that. I'm looking at last week's utilization data and like where we landed on things like how many visits did we complete per hour of posted provider availability, and how is that like tracking against our assumption. Like I look at those on at least a weekly basis, like sometimes more frequently, and we're adjusting things like pretty dynamically, like with week to week, at least like on the capacity side. We also have, like things like the start dates are changing all the time. And so we're often having to like change things around, like in real time.
Let's talk about that. So basically that a lot of the reason this is hard is because there's a lot of entropy and slowness, or I guess relative slowness, in the process of onboarding new people. Can you just talk about, I think you've told me your time frame is about 2 months, 60 days to get someone onboarded. I mean, I think to the uninitiated, that seems like a long time, but to the initiated, maybe, oh, actually, it sounds pretty fast. What have you done to speed that up? And like, what ideas do you have to, I guess another way of asking is like, what takes a long time, and like, what do you think the levers are that you've either pulled already or could pull to make that faster?
Yeah, we've sped it up quite a bit. Like I think we used to be closer to probably 3 months. Like we recently got our average down to something closer to like just under 2 months, which is good. There's a lot of, for medical groups that need to credential providers. And I think credentialing is really like a two-pronged thing. There's credentialing to be appointed to the practice. Like, is this provider safe? Do they have a clear criminal record and no hits on their licenses? And there's like payer enrollment, and both of those things require, I'd say, like the biggest roadblock, and the thing that is the biggest drag on the time in the process is like getting that initial information from providers. And we can automate the process once we have the information, but we still rely on them to give it to us. And especially when you're hiring providers across 50 states, and many of them have a lot of licenses. And for us, especially for OBGYNs that tend to, maybe more than other specialties, have malpractice histories or have worked in like surgery, that creates like a little more friction around that process too. And so we've automated a lot of the like the forms. We try and like really minimize the forms down to one that providers need to load all their information in, so that we can also like automate nudges around it. Immediately when someone is hired, they will get a welcome to credentialing email without human intervention. So that was like a big win for us in taking this time in that timeline down. And they'll get a reminder every day until they complete it. Once we have the information, it's a lot more within our control to move things fast and push on our team for turnaround times. And I'd say like working with an external vendor, which we do for credentialing as well, that is reliable and trustworthy. And like, we're very happy with the turnaround times that we get from our vendor, but I know other companies might have a different experience. So those are like the biggest things. And then also thinking about streamlining your your training process for clinicians, really like what needs to happen for day one success versus what can be sort of dripped to new providers over their first few weeks, which has the added benefit of sort of not overwhelming them and also like shortening the process overall.
I'm glad you like your credentialing vendor. I've heard things about many credentialing vendors.
Horror stories.
I think people may be asking you after this, who is your credentialing vendor? Something that we did at Bicycle that I thought was a cool idea was we actually gave people a cash bonus if they collected their information prior to their start date. I don't know if you've tried anything like that, but it did speed things up. And like, since you're basically paying pretty big for the days that go by after they're hired, it just makes financial sense.
Awesome. And we are getting towards the end here. So we have one more topic that we wanted to dive into, which is the staffing model. Then we're going to do some wrap ups and takeaways. So good time to leave any comments or questions in the chat if you have any for our fantastic guests. So Jordana, my understanding is that you, I believe, started with a larger percentage of contractor staffing and then moved more to W-2. Is that right? And if so, why? What's the reasoning behind that move?
Yeah, that is true. So we started we started entirely with contractors, and then just in the last year have started to change that mix to also include employees. I think I distill it down to contractors are really helpful for like flexible capacity, right? Like when you're early, at least like within our business model, right? Like where it's a synchronous care model, like completely dependent on a patient visit, happening to generate revenue. Like contractors are really good to like flex up and down demand. It's actually like another short-term lever that we use a lot, right? Like we're seeing a seasonal spike. We can ask our contractors to give more hours, or we can incentivize them to do so. Whereas having employees really gives us a core set of hours that we also have more control over, saying like when those hours are, how many they are. We can do things like set visits per week standards, like productivity and utilization standards, so that we can do a lot better prediction with more of our workforce as to how many visits they are going to do. Right. There are, of course, like trade-offs in like the costs of employees and contractors. But for us, we've found that like having a mix, allows us to like achieve what we want in terms of our margins, while also like building a little more like stability, or really a lot more stability into like our model.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like a key. Is essentially you want that baseline of W-2 for all the reasons you said, but then you also want this like kind of flex cloud that just allows to not have to be perfect on the projections. I've talked to a lot of companies that, and I've been involved in a few, that just didn't want to do part-time. Usually the logic was we have a unique clinical model, and also it just takes as much time to train a part-timer as it does to train a full-timer. So a lot of cost there. How have you dealt with that? Do you think, I guess, for any does having like kind of like a flexible cloud of 1099s, even if it's just like 10 or 20% of the capacity, do you think that makes sense for everyone? Or are there situations where you just need everyone full time?
That's a good question. I don't know that I agree with the premise that like it's a lot more, it's the same amount of effort. Like I think there's a lot that goes into like managing employees that is different. I think like it makes a lot of sense to utilize like either all of one or the other. I've been at companies utilizing all of one or the other. I was at a company where, right, like we were B2B, like there was a much more, again, like predictable demand from the beginning. We had contracts that supported our clinical workforce directly, sort of like regardless of volume. Like obviously those are very obvious use cases for like leaning more towards employees. I think when you're very small and growing, all of the times I've been in that like pre-seed to seed or like early building stage, you almost have to exclusively start with contractors until you have enough demand to make a W-2 position financially viable at all. And then I'd say it's just like really dependent on like your growth stage, sort of like your business model and like your capacity strategy, right? Like how flexible or how consistent do you need it to be? How important is that for your patients?
Yeah, and one other thing. Well, this one last reminder. This would be a good time for Q&A. So any questions that anyone in the audience has, drop them in. And while we wait for those to come in, one other thing that I feel like I hadn't quite appreciated is how much the care model, the types of providers involved in care, should also influence these decisions org to org. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, right. We actually, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but we have definitely like a different strategy by specialty too. So we have multiple specialties at Allara, but the demand for some of them, like endocrinology, for example, is not as consistent as it is for like our core women's health, like hormonal care services. And so at this time, right, like we're not employing endocrinologists as W-2s. We're still using contractors there because that's still, not as consistent, or like we don't have a need for that in the same way that we do for women's health or our dietitians. Like as we look to pilot new specialties and expand our clinical model, we'll definitely start right by using contractors and having that flexible ability. So I think even within our overall practice, there are differences in what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Great. And so we are going to get to wrap up here. And the way we're going to wrap up is we're going to go around and each of us are going to share our kind of high level takeaways. So if someone was leaving this session with a single learning, what do you think they should walk away with if they've been tuning out for everything else? So I'll go first to buy you some time. To me, and this is kind of similar to my takeaway from our last session, which was with Karen Underwood from Verda, talking about the mix of the overlap of D2C and B2B2C marketing. And a lot of what I heard from her, and is also kind of oddly or maybe not so oddly showing up here, is really about like the ability to listen to your business and listen to your particular audience. Like it feels like there are signals that are showing up, and they might be signals that you discover each and every time you go back to review the forecast and review the actuals. And sometimes it's very clear data like CAC or wait times, and sometimes it's a little bit more abstract. It's really about getting to know your audience and your patients and dialing things in from there. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, I've actually been kind of pondering on a few things in this conversation. One thing that when Josh was talking about kind of managing the demand, it really stuck out to me that, he said that you have this very complex AI on the demands generation side, like, the Googles and the Facebooks. And they're basically just constantly pushing towards giving you more of what worked yesterday, which works in like an e-commerce situation, works in like a SaaS situation. But in this situation where you have limited capacity, you're kind of constantly fighting that. So you have to constantly correct it. And that's like what a lot of the work here is. It's essentially like patching that bug in these demand systems. I think the other piece is interesting. It makes me just wonder, if you have this very complicated AI that's like can generate demand for you, like what's this going to look like in a year or two? Like how are we going to build that equivalent automation or AI that kind of does that on our end? It just got me thinking what that could look like. And yeah.
Fantastic. Josh, how about you?
I think I would just say this whole thing takes a village, I think is what my big takeaway is. It's not simple enough. It's one of the more complicated pieces of what I've found. You have to figure out in this. Like, as I said, I came from an e-com background, and as Chris just kind of alluded to, a lot of these systems are built. A lot of the sort of growth marketing, performance marketing systems are built to help people sell handbags and shoes and whatnot. And so you'll get a meta rep telling you should be consolidating all of your campaigns into one place. And it's like, no, we need them split so we can control our state spend. Or anyway, I'm digressing from my original point. I think the bigger picture thing though is like, if you're at an earlier stage and you haven't run into the stuff we were talking about that makes you think capacity might be an issue right now, I would definitely encourage you to like at least add one metric to your weekly dashboards that might get you ahead of it, so that you don't go through the same thing I think I've gone through twice, which is reverse engineering, trying to like figure out what's wrong with conversion rates or whatnot, and ultimately figuring out, it's this capacity crunch. I would start from having that in place if I was starting at another company from scratch again. And I'm not a big fan of meetings, but I do think like the one we have every week with this growth ops is really important. So that goes back to if there's one big takeaway, I think it's get everybody on the same page. Make sure everybody at your org understands, the implications for their metrics, their own department, and then make sure everybody's kind of in conversation, at least like biweekly or monthly, depending on your organization's stage, and just make sure everybody's kind of aware of what everybody else is dealing with, so that it's not this bubble. Just you're wondering like, why are we out of capacity? If you start to understand like what it takes to hire, what it takes to license, what it takes to credential, then you can build those longer term models and just have a lot more smoothness to everything that you do.
Fantastic. And Jordana, bring us home.
It's funny because, and I didn't make this up, I was going to say it takes a village, which actually like highlights maybe another point, which is like the importance of this partnership, Josh. Like you said, it's good to hear we're on like literally the same page and having like a mind meld on that, because like really like my takeaway felt like data plus context, right? And that context happens through like really intentional and proactive communication. And then like taking that, like it takes a village further on the ops side, I think if you're, for the clinical operations people in the room, I think having a really good team, right, like you're really relying on talent, you're really relying on credentialing, you're really relying on all of these things like coming together at the right time, and all of those things feeding you the data and the context that you need to make that decision and to communicate with your growth partner. So
love it. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your insights with us. This was fantastic, and I think just as nerdy as Chris was hoping for. So thank you for keeping Chris happy. To everybody that is in the audience watching, listening, we would love your participation in growing the Digital Health Growth Mastermind community. So if you're interested in joining, want to hear about more of these live shows, want to hear about our in-person meetups, please scan the QR code that we're going to throw up on the screen right now, or follow the link that we'll put in the chat, and click on that link, scan that QR code, and you'll stay in the loop. Also wanted to tease for next time, in February, Chris and I are going to be talking about how to create the perfect piece of healthcare content for marketing, especially as AI kind of throws out the traditional playbook there. So what goes into the perfect piece of healthcare marketing content? An exciting one. I hope to see you all there. Thank you for being here today. Thanks again to Josh and Jordana for lending us your expertise, and everybody else, I will see you next time. Bye.